beyond that which we observe, or presents reality from a novel point of view. If Aristotle or St. Thomas Aquinas use the word that we translate as imagination, they usually mean the mental capacity for forming images without direct sensory input, so my ability to picture something. In general terms, imagination usually refers to a capacity for invention, whether this is artistic or narrative or related to play or some other activity. Now, all of these meanings are related in the same family, so to speak, but none of them captures wholly the sense in which I want to use the term in this presentation. So in moral philosophy, there's a tendency to distinguish the type of imagination that we're talking about by calling it moral imagination. There's not a single accepted definition of what this is, but in simple terms, it refers to the view of the world in which our moral commitments and understanding of good and bad, or good and evil, makes sense. So when we talk about a Catholic imagination, we do not just mean the capacity of Catholics to be creative, but a view or an understanding of the world informed by Catholic truth, and in which Catholic moral and intellectual commitments make sense. The content of imagination goes beyond what is true or false, what exists in the world and what does not, to take into account the relationships between these constitutive elements, their value, their movement, their function. Imagination is a rich enough tableau, or if you prefer, a solid enough foundation, to hold comfortably side by side both the universal precepts and the personal motivations that we talk about when we're talking about the moral life, what I ought to do, and also how I think about it, how I value it. It's a complex understanding that we use to reinterpret our experiences, to make moral determinations, or to structure our actions. Now, this is not to say that it's consciously held. Many of our suppositions may be unconscious, forming reactions in a way that perhaps we could explain if we were asked to, but that we might not ever really reflect upon. Now, in this presentation, I've been asked to talk specifically about the connection between literature and the Catholic imagination. So lurking behind this topic is the question, in a sense, what makes a book Catholic? This I will answer simply. A Catholic book is one that expresses a Catholic imagination. It's not necessarily connected to the author's own creedal commitments. I will eventually talk about Tolkien, as this I understand is obligatory when discussing Catholic lit. But first, I will, perhaps perversely, take you on a tour of the writings of Jane Austen and suggest that her books are very Catholic indeed. The first thing we must do, though, is sketch out some necessary content of what we call the Catholic imagination, how we're going to understand this worldview. So in his book, conveniently titled The Catholic Imagination, Father Andrew Greeley describes this topic like this. Catholics live in an enchanted world, a world of statues and holy water, stained glass and votive candles, saints and religious medals, rosary beads and holy pictures. But these Catholic paraphernalia are mere hints of a deeper and more pervasive religious sensibility, which inclines Catholics to see the holy lurking in creation. As Catholics, we find our houses and our worlds haunted by the sense that the objects, events, and persons of daily life are revelations of grace. The special Catholic imagination can appropriately be called sacramental. It sees created reality as a sacrament, that is, a revelation of the presence of God. Now, Greeley's study in this book is empirical, as well as speculative. He claims to demonstrate not that this is how Catholics ought to think, but that this is how, in fact, they do think, maybe not consciously. He sees sociological studies as demonstrating that whatever their habits of religious practice, there is a latent Catholic culture that forms how the faithful think about the world and how they behave. Catholics, he claims, socialize more, maintain closer ties with family, apparently have more frequent and more satisfying marital sex than their Protestant counterparts. Now, Greeley cites statistically relevant findings from sociological surveys to support all of these points. Now, these features Greeley links to a distinctively Catholic imagery of God that's employed in art, in poetry, in theater, in film, that serves to make the divine immanent in Catholic communities, in families, and even in Catholics' conceptions of erotic desire and activity. In contrast to Greeley, I'm less concerned with how Catholics do think and behave, and more concerned with what features of imagination would render it authentically Catholic. And so, Greeley says there is this imagination, and whether or not people say, yeah, that's absolutely what I see, their behavior reflects that this is how they live within the world. That's as may be. I'm kind of concerned with articulating more specifically, to call something a Catholic imagination, what features would it have to have? So obviously sacramentality does shape the worldview that leads us to light a candle in church, or to offer grace before meals, or perhaps pray ahead of an exam or a sporting match. Some people are sniffy about these types of prayers and devotions, as the reasons for them seem too mundane to be worthy of an appeal to the divine. You see a sportsman crossing himself before going to take a penalty kick or something and think, I'm not sure God really cares. But people do this, and there's some sense of a connection that brings them to do this. But this is just what a sacramental attitude will lead us to do, to unite heaven and earth in our minds and allow a sense of the sacred to permeate even the very ordinary things that we do. Now, on the other hand, it was the realization of the complete sacramentality of the Catholic ways of thought and practice that eventually persuaded Blessed John Henry Newman to convert. In October, I get to start saying St. John Henry Newman, which is very exciting. Father Ian Kerr describes how Newman was awestruck when he learned that the Blessed Sacrament is reserved in every Catholic church the world over. This practice, Newman insisted, makes Catholic churches true temples. God is present in them. There's nothing metaphorical about the Catholic claim that the church is God's house. God is actually there. He saw in this that it was the Catholic Church that truly offers, and through her patient guardianship of the faith and administration of the sacraments maintains, actual contact with God in this life as a foretaste of heaven. If you have occasion to visit the chapel at Maryvale in Birmingham, where Newman set up his first oratory, you can still see the window he had installed in a cupboard in his bedroom so that he could look into the chapel and see the tabernacle. He could sit in contemplation or glance up from study, prayer, or recreation and see where God dwells, even when he wasn't involved in the great sacrifice of the Mass, down kind of in the chapel. There was this window he specifically put there to bring this sacramentality into, you could say, his most mundane or private moments. In Newman's eyes, it is this sense of sacramentality that is the great gift of the Church. Now, given the fundamental role played by the sacraments in the practice of the Catholic faith, the inclusion of sacramentality in the Catholic imagination is not contentious. I haven't come across anybody who's going to argue with it. Where I perhaps depart, or at least expand upon this axiom, is that I think there's more to the Catholic imagination than just sacramentality. I've set up imagination to be a specific type of thought within moral philosophy. Moral philosophy is concerned with the choices and actions of human persons. It's reasonable to assume, therefore, that any notion of Catholic imagination would be incomplete without accounting for how human actions are shaped by and understood within a sacramental world. Traditionally, for example, we tend to associate with the Catholic worldview words like virtue and sin, which explicitly relate human actions and tendencies to God. Catholics understand that we receive in baptism the virtues of faith, hope, and charity to be developed through a life of faithful practice. And likewise in confirmation, we're endowed with the gifts of the Holy Spirit: wisdom, understanding, knowledge, counsel, fortitude, piety, and fear of the Lord. So there's a focus on the state of one's soul, not simply the qualities of one's actions, but we look in kind of a Catholic understanding at how virtues shape what it is that we do. Catholic moral theology is deeply formed by the virtue tradition and understands that moral life is not a series of applications of a decision procedure, a series of calculations, but an exercise in the development of virtue, which itself entails repentance and reform. The Catholic faith has very high ideals, enjoining the faithful to become like Christ, and naming saints as those who succeed in imitating him. But knowing the difficulty of this task and the contrary movement of our natural inclinations, the Catholic faith also has a deep understanding of sin and supplies a remedy, indeed a sacramental one. So I would claim as intrinsic to the Catholic imagination a sense of morality based in virtue and character development. There may well be other essential features, but for the purposes of my project here, which is essentially one in moral philosophy, this will suffice for now. Okay? So to turn to literature, because otherwise we'll run out of time and we'll never get to Tolkien. Now, it is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. This, as most of you will immediately recognize, is the playful opening line of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Playful in that I have no doubt Miss Austen meant us to laugh. As universal truths go, it seems downright provincial, or to take the term so many commentators use to describe Austen's outlook, very bourgeois. But much of its playfulness comes from an underlying truth, not of its claim that all bachelors of comfortable means are immediately desirous of matrimony, but of the statement that this is generally assumed to be the case. The joke becomes explicit in the next line. However little is known of the feelings or views of such a man. Upon entering the neighborhood, this truth is so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families that he is considered the rightful property of one or other of their daughters. Even before we've met a single character, Miss Austen has drawn us a picture of the world and invited us to laugh at its foibles. We know from the start that marriage and financial stability are extremely important. We learn as the novel continues why this should be especially the case for the Bennet sisters. Lacking a brother, upon the death of their father, their home of Longbourn will pass to their cousin, Mr. Collins. The five sisters and their mothers face a bleak and uncertain future following the eventual and inevitable death of Mr. Bennet, unless at least one, preferably two or three, can manage to find a single man in possession of a good fortune and secure him. Unless they manage to do this, all six women can expect to die in poverty, wholly dependent for their comfort and respectability on the charity of their relations. In the hands of a less gifted author, the story of the Bennet family would actually be a very tense and dreary tale. I mean, there is a lot on the line here, which we often overlook in Jane Austen, which we think of as very kind of light character dramas. But Jane Austen's knack for keen observation, for laughing at what she finds ridiculous without diminishing what is good and right, makes the novel a delightfully fresh and witty romance. So if I suggest that these opening lines draw us imaginatively into the novel, I do not simply mean that we modern readers must adapt ourselves to Regency social strictures and structures, but that we must view the story and its setting from a certain perspective. Yes, the story is set in 19th century Hertfordshire, and yes, we might need some knowledge and imagination to engage intelligently or meaningfully with the text. But for Jane Austen's original audience, this was not so. Her books were once contemporary fiction. Very serious scholars might read the opening lines of Pride and Prejudice and then proceed to tell us about the sociology of marriage, the relationship between the sexes, and the fiscal and financial nature of Regency society. But this is surely not why Jane Austen wrote these lines. She was writing for people who were already in these circumstances. You're also very lucky I'm not a serious scholar, and I'm not going to bore you with all of that. This is one reason we can be sure of the satire and the playful irony in these words. We're meant to laugh, because this is not social history, it's social commentary. Additionally, Miss Austen was not a journalist. She doesn't tell us the story of Elizabeth Bennet so that we may be informed of the particulars of her biography. There's something else at work. She sets her story in the ordinary world as she knew it, immediately shows us the ridiculousness of a very important aspect of that world, which her contemporary readers would nonetheless understand to have a very serious and logical basis. So we might ask the question, how is Jane Austen influencing her audience? I do not mean what is her specific conscious project, but rather what is it that literature does? It seems nonsensical to assume that she's trying to influence our knowledge, like a journalist does. The fictional nature of literature precludes that aim from, being present. But it does seem that she's trying to influence our perception of the world, or certain aspects of it. In this case, marriage, social class, affection, and as the novel's very title broadcasts, certain character traits that influence how the protagonists approach these issues, namely pride and prejudice. Essentially, fiction is structured to have a moral influence. It draws you into this perspective. Now, I can hear people thinking it, so you don't need to wait till question time to politely inform me that novels are read for entertainment, that novelists are not moral philosophers, and that I'm overcomplicating one of the greatest enjoyments in life by analyzing and dissecting it. You might even be wanting to remind me that in Jane Austen's time, too much novel reading was thought to addle and soften one's mind, in much the way we now tend to claim too much TV or iPad time does. You might even want to point out that Miss Austen wrote a whole novel poking fun at the dire effects of Gothic novels on the mind and perceptions of poor, flighty Catherine Morland, who nearly torpedoes her own chance of happiness through her giddy fantasies of dark secrets going on in Northanger Abbey. To put this in a modern context, and for anybody who hasn't read Northanger Abbey, Catherine Morland is quite addicted to Gothic novels, and she has an invitation to go to Northanger Abbey, which is this old and, rather Gothic house, and starts to, imagine that there are these secrets that, Mr. Tilney, who owns it, is hiding, kind of murder and other sorts of things, and, just really kind of makes a mess of it through being rather hysterical. It's a satirical novel. People often think it's the most boring. I actually think every 13-year-old girl should be forced to read it, because at that age you're fairly sympathetic to Catherine Morland, and in the end you see what happens to her. But in any case, to put this in a more modern context, The Castle of Otranto, which was Horace Walpole's original Gothic novel, I think published in 1796, was basically the Regency version of 50 Shades of Grey. Ladies read it with breathless enjoyment and subsequently decided that being dragged off to some rich man's dungeon was the height of romance. So I hope you see my point here, pilfered without any remorse from Jane Austen herself. Although literature is often written and read with the primary objective of entertainment, it does not therefore follow that it doesn't have a moral nature or moral influence. So T.S. Eliot writes about this at some length in his essay, Religion and Literature. He writes, though we may read literature merely for pleasure or for entertainment or aesthetic enjoyment, this reading never affects simply a special sort of sense. It affects us as entire human beings. It affects our moral and religious existence. Well, how so, we might ask? Well, to read Pride and Prejudice for enjoyment, I have to allow Jane Austen to influence my view of the world. It's a ridiculous or senseless story unless I'm willing to take up her point of view of the society and the persons therein and their choices. Now, we may, of course, read critically. We can read skeptically, even disbelievingly, though these stances are going to impact our enjoyment of the novel. It's hard to read critically and for enjoyment at the same time. But in the end, if I do derive enjoyment from a novel, and I find the story and the characters hang together, or at least attractive to me, I'm very likely to take forward into my own view of the world certain features of the authors, or to repudiate that which is precluded in her view. In other words, her imagination, as captured in her writing, comes to influence my imagination or my idea of how the world fits together. What is good or bad, important or frivolous, humorous or sacrosanct in seriousness. Indeed, I think it is this structure of engagement with a novel that leads Eliot to assert that reading undertaken purely for enjoyment may have a much more profound influence upon us than that we undertake with an idea of advancing our intellectual or our moral formation. Improving reading, as both Eliot and Austen called it. What we're moving towards with this claim is a potentially religious view of imagination, a sense in which it could be rightly described as Catholic or otherwise. Again, in the words of Eliot, the common ground between religion and fiction is behavior. Our religion imposes our ethics, our judgment and criticism of ourselves, and our behavior towards our fellow man. The fiction we read affects our behavior towards our fellow man, affects our patterns of ourselves. When we read of human beings behaving in certain ways with the approval of the author, who gives his benediction of this behavior by his attitude towards the result of the behavior arranged by himself, we can be influenced to behaving in the same way. Telling a story is more than relating the particulars of a series of events, real or imagined. In Aristotle's Poetics, he describes storytelling like any other art as a form of imitation. While the sculptor, by his craft, makes imitations of the human form, those who tell stories represent, quote, actions with agents who are necessarily either good men or bad. The diversities of human character being nearly always derivative from this primary distinction, since the line between virtue and vice is one dividing the whole of mankind. For Aristotle, because stories are about people, they're always in some sense moral projects. You simply cannot write about the actions of a man without relating them to his moral character. The characters are necessarily distinguished by their virtue. Indeed, it is instructive that we call a person created by a storyteller a character, which word we also use to describe the interior moral quality of a person. The original Greek word, character, or charakter, it's sometimes transliterated, referred primarily to a tool used for carving. That's what a character was. So it would be for carving a seal or an imprint produced by this seal. From the same root, we get such words as caricature, characteristic. There's a metaphor at work here. Authors, in some sense, carve out or construct their characters, and likewise, our character is a part of us that's carved or formed. It's not innate. We're not born good or bad. So this use of the same word for our moral substance and for the people we meet in fiction comes from the Greek. It's not actually an innovation of English, which when I looked it up a few years ago, I thought it might be. I thought, are we translating two different words in Aristotle as character? But it's exactly the same. And it's in some sense metaphorical in both sense, but it brings it together, this idea that, storytelling and literature started as an examination of moral character and formation. So if we take seriously Eliot's claim that religion and literature hold behavior as their common ground, we might advance the argument that an author who takes up a Catholic perspective, or one that is at least deeply compatible with Catholicism, so perhaps doesn't appear sacramental, but this may be a function of the scope of the story, not a denial of sacramentality. There are some stories that would be quite hard to get an explicitly sacramental view into, but there are plenty of authors who might write things that aren't at odds with it. Any author who can do this could be supposed to present the Catholic imagination, whether he or she is creedally Catholic. Now, I've begun this section about Jane Austen because I take her as a paradigm example of a non-Catholic Catholic author. So there are many features I could draw on of Jane Austen's deep Catholicity in her storytelling, but I'll confine myself to a single theme. The relationship she consistently shows between the passions and the virtues. There's a large body of both popular and scholarly work arguing for Jane Austen's credentials as a moral philosopher in the virtue tradition. It's almost become a bit of a platitude. This is the perspective she's writing from. And then there are, and so obviously the virtue tradition is a very deeply Catholic one, or the one that the kind of Catholic thought drew on and has brought through the ages. But then there are those who call Jane Austen sterile, who see no feeling in her writing. Chief amongst these detractors was Charlotte Brontë, who wrote the following words in a letter in 1850. She does her business of delineating the surface of the lives of genteel English people curiously well. There is a miniature delicacy in the painting. She ruffles her readers by nothing vehement, disturbs them by nothing profound. The passions are perfectly unknown to her. She rejects even a speaking acquaintance with that stormy sisterhood. Even to the feelings she vouchsafes no more than an occasional graceful but distant recognition. Elsewhere, Charlotte Brontë refers to Jane Austen's work as too highly cultivated and pruned, lacking in vivid physiognomy and untamed nature. I have two issues with these claims. The first is that insofar as they're true, they describe virtues, not shortcomings. The second is that they're mostly not true. Austen simply describes a different relationship between the passions and reason than Bronte does, and therefore conveys a different anthropology and a different moral philosophy. So to begin with, Jane Austen's acquaintance with the passions is apparent in dozens of passages. But it's particularly hard to accuse the author of any lack of feeling when you read the letter that Captain Frederick Wentworth wrote to Miss Anne Elliot in Persuasion, having just overheard her claim to Captain Benwick that women are more constant in their affections when all hope of satisfaction is gone, and tormented by years of heartache that her rejection of his proposal has caused. Captain Wentworth wrote these words: "I can listen no longer in silence. I must speak to you by such means as are within my reach. You pierce my soul. I am half agony, half hope. Tell me not that I am too late, that such precious feelings are gone forever. I offer myself to you again with a heart even more your own than when you almost broke it 8.5 years ago. Dare not say that man forgets sooner than woman, that his love has an earlier death. I have loved none but you. Unjust I may have been. Weak and resentful I have been, but never inconstant. You alone have brought me to Bath. For you alone I think and plan. Have you not seen this? Can you fail to have understood my wishes? I had not waited even these 10 days could I have read your feelings as I think you must have penetrated mine. I can hardly write. I am in every instant hearing something which overpowers me. You sink your voice, but I can distinguish the tones of that voice when they would have been lost to others. Too good, too excellent creature, you do us justice indeed. You do believe that there is true attachment and constancy among men. Believe it to be most fervent and undeviating in F.W." Maybe Charlotte Bronte never read Persuasion. But still, what more can the man do? Bleed onto the page? Needless to say, Anne is appropriately flustered by receiving such a letter, and after so many years of dignified anguish and separation, the lovers are reunited. But whilst they may mourn lost opportunities, Captain Wentworth indeed urgently asks Anne if she would have become engaged to him 6 years earlier when he returned to England between voyages, and she replies that she would have. Austen is very clear to point out the greater happiness the couple now enjoy than could have been theirs in the beginning, writing, "There they returned again to the past, more exquisitely happy, perhaps, in their reunion than when it had first been projected, more tender, more tried, more fixed in their knowledge of each other's character, truth and attachment, more equal to act, more justified in acting." For Jane Austen's characters feel the strongest passions, but they're not overcome. They do not run wild. They are pruned, the more glorious bloom to produce. For what is cultivation but the work of man to direct and heighten the bounty and beauty of nature? All of her characters, Anne and Wentworth, Elizabeth and Darcy, Jane and Bingley, Eleanor and Edward, and Marianne and Brandon, Fanny and Edmund, and even Emma and Knightley, and in a different way, Catherine Morland and Henry Tilney. They all reach maturity in the fulfillment of their romantic longing, but only because each in his or her lover finds support of virtue and palliation of vice. It's not merely their passions that are satiated, but something deeper in their souls. Austen heroines don't give in, they grow up consistently. Consider now Jane Eyre, Charlotte Bronte's magnum opus. And I'm sorry if this is dear to you, but I'll have considered it a good night if I can ruin Jane Eyre for even one person. Though she is prudish and moralistic, Jane, there's courage and determination as well. She has admirable qualities. There's a true desire to be good and to do right. And she never compromises, until she does. How is it that Jane and the revamped Bluebeard figure, Edward Rochester, end up together? Does the rake and attempted bigamist reform? No. But since his first wife, the mad, bad Berta, maybe, or she dies, maybe, and possibly, but not proven, by his hand, in part, at least, through his cruelty and neglect, at least in the end, it was legal, Jane and Rochester. And he was maimed and blinded in the house fire, so his fidelity was more or less assured through lack of other options. But is Rochester humbled and reformed? So unconvincing is the text on this point that when at the age of 14 I first read the famous line, "Reader, I married him," I think I tossed the book aside and didn't pick it up to finish the last few lines grudgingly for about 6 months. Just when one thinks Jane has been lucky enough to escape the clearly unbalanced St. John Rivers, she goes running back to some low-budget Byron with an extremely inadmirable moral flexibility and a sinister sense of entitlement. Circumstances, not characters, evolve in Charlotte Bronte's novel. Passion wins. But does Jane? Does Rochester even? That's less certain. Contrast this with the famous reform of Mr. Darcy in Austen's Pride and Prejudice. The novel specifically maligned by Charlotte Bronte, incidentally, in the passages I read you before. Unlike Jane Eyre, who accepts Rochester's proposal of marriage, quote, "poor and obscure and small and plain as you are," in Rochester's stated estimation, Elizabeth Bennet, hearing a proposal rather similar in content and tone, pulls Mr. Darcy up with the following words. "I might as well inquire why, with so an evident design of offending and insulting me, you chose to tell me that you liked me against your will, against your reason, and even against your character." In this scene, we have the crystallization of the central problem of the book, pride and prejudice, for now Lizzie must discover and suffer from her own misapprehension. And this problem is not created by external circumstances, but by the nature of the characters involved. If Lizzie had accepted Darcy despite his disdain for her, despite his defects, even if she had managed to feel flattered enough by his attention or dazzled enough by his fortune to form a passionate attachment of her own, Pride and Prejudice would have become a garden variety semi-tragic romance, for passion would win, but it would bring no happiness. How could it? He was not the man she deserved, and if she accepted any less than that, she wouldn't be the woman he imagined. Character, not feeling, is the basis for a sound marriage in Jane Austen, as we hear in Lizzie's reflections in the midst of the scandalous Lydia and Wickham affair, several chapters later. She, Lizzie, began now to comprehend that Darcy was the man who, in disposition and talents, would most suit her. His understanding and temper, though unlike her own, would have answered all her wishes. It was a union that must have been to the advantage of both. By her ease and liveliness, his mind might have been softened, his manners improved, and from his judgment, information, and knowledge of the world, she might have received benefit of greater importance. But how little permanent happiness could belong to a couple like Lydia and Wickham, who were only brought together because their passions were stronger than their virtue, she could not easily conjecture. This, rather than any insensitivity, is why Austen skims over heartfelt declarations with little detail, and how right she is to do so. What could knowing Darcy's words add to the description of what followed Elizabeth's acceptance of his second proposal? The reader was assured that he, quote, expressed himself on the occasion as sensibly and warmly as a man violently in love can be supposed to do. Elizabeth is so overcome she cannot meet his eyes or look up at him. The passion is there, but it's in some sense an embellishment, and there's something of much greater importance underneath. The important words Austen records. Darcy relates the transformation of character wrought by Elizabeth. He says, "By you I was properly humbled. I came to you without doubt of my reception. You showed me how insufficient were all my pretensions to please a woman worthy of being pleased." This, in a line, is what's wrong with Charlotte Bronte's conception of romance. Rochester is manifestly insufficient to please a woman worthy of being pleased. And so in being pleased by him, the otherwise worthy Jane Eyre is rather debased. This is what happens if in the end one's passion is stronger than one's virtue. The role of a novel, if it is to express Catholic imagination, is in some sense to show the beauty of virtue and by extension the ugliness of the opposite. That probably sounds prudishly moralistic and likely to lead to very wearying, heavy-handed tales. So let's put it another way. All stories are moral because they're about people and their actions and what they do, and those are moral. Stories tell us what's good by showing us what's beautiful. So we present the good actions as beautiful and the bad actions as the reverse. Jane Eyre is a confused tale that reveals an underlying moral confusion in the author. The reader spends nearly the whole book admiring Jane's dogged perseverance and goodness, her refusal to be coerced, her courage in resisting Rochester, who's the embodiment of selfishness and incontinence. Then, without significant reform, Rochester gets Jane anyhow. Does he suffer? Well, undoubtedly, but not all suffering is redemptive. The death of his first wife is sufficient to allow Jane to give in to her inexplicable passion for him. And the result is that all of Jane's goodness, which was so poetically portrayed as the source of her strength and freedom, is reduced to a sort of legalism. Now it's okay, the first wife is dead. Charlotte Bronte writes that Jane was happy. Well, how improbable. The most that can be said is that, if not reformed, Rochester is at least hobbled in his tyranny by his infirmity. And so there's a lucky sort of blissful ending, which tells us above all that life's beauty rests not on moral character, but in getting what you want, whether or not the object of desire is worthy. And that's just drivel. Just so I do not give you the impression that I'm calling for realism in writing, or what I'm criticizing in Jane Eyre is a lack of plausibility, given that in a moment I'll start talking about a man who wrote about hobbits and elves and orcs. That would be really perverse. Let me point out that I know Jane Austen's stories also defy plausibility in a concrete sense, that she too has her share of overblown romance. The exchange between Elizabeth and Darcy, in which she asks him how he came to fall in love with her, for one. My beauty you had earlier withstood, and as for my manners, my behavior to you was at least always bordering on uncivil, and I never spoke to you without rather wishing to give you pain than not. Now be sincere. Did you admire me for my impertinence? For the liveliness of your mind, I did. Now that is pure smut. Even Elizabeth and Darcy have to immediately go write letters to their aunts after this exchange, which is acknowledged to be the least erotic activity in the world. We now know that Darcy is rich, handsome, properly humble, generous, and just, and on top of that, he's attracted to women, or rather a woman, who's too clever for her own good and certainly more quick-witted than he is. And yet, in my view, the effect of the story isn't spoiled by these flights of fancy because there's an underlying moral picture that's sound. It's a picture I want to recommend to you as proof that Jane Austen is, in a very important sense, imaginatively Catholic, which I don't mean heretical or improvising in any regard there, but there's a feature of her imagination which sits very comfortably within a Catholic moral worldview. And so allowing yourself to be shaped by this view of virtue, particularly where romantic attachment is concerned, will give you a fairly Catholic view of the subject. Now, to the extent that there's any sacramentality in Austen's view of marriage or anything else, I'll admit that's tacit. We can't kind of go through and say, oh, look, here's a sly biblical reference. They're not there. That's not what she was writing about. But the picture she paints of the relationship between virtue and the passion sits so comfortably within a Catholic conception of the world that I'm satisfied she's a sound example of how this project works and of how we might relate in a Catholic and imaginative sense to literature. Now, finally, the moment we've all been waiting for. It's time for 3 pages of Tolkien. Having talked at some length earlier about sacramentality, it would be remiss of me not to look at if and how it can be conveyed in literature. In this regard, the name that's most commonly mentioned is J.R.R. Tolkien, whose Lord of the Rings trilogy is often referred to as expressing the sacramental imagination. There are dozens of examples of explicitly sacramental imagery in the trilogy. Lembas bread, a single bite, sustains a grown man for a whole day. It translates as elvish way bread. Well, this is the viaticum, it's the Eucharist, food for the journey. Galadriel is a Marian figure. The rope she gives Sam is like a rosary to pull him up out of the dark pit when nothing else will allow them to escape. What else? The flooding of Isengard recalls the purgative flood of the Old Testament and also baptism, the idea of washing away everything that's accumulated. So you'll no doubt have your own examples in mind. However, I don't claim that Tolkien thinks sacramentally because Frodo is sustained by lembas bread. And we're sustained by the Eucharist, and look, how Catholic is that? That would be quite simplistic, and Tolkien himself would be absolutely outraged because he had this he didn't like that type of symbolism. He didn't recognize it in his own writing, but he absolutely abhorred it in Lewis's. It was kind of, I don't like your Jesus lion kind of thing. But he was absolutely adamant that he wasn't writing allegory. However, moral action and the actions and the characters themselves become, in a sense, sacramental in Tolkien's writings. This I see in the sacrificial themes that run through the story. So, to begin at both the beginning and the end of the books in a funny way, consider a tale that Tolkien provides in the Annals of the King, one of the appendices of Return of the King, the story of Aragorn. Now, the elves by whom he was raised called Aragorn Astel, which, according to Tolkien, means hope in Elvish. When he come to manhood and was aware of who he was, because it was concealed for a long time from Aragorn that he was Isildur's heir, that he was the rightful king of Gondor, Aragorn pays a final visit to his mother. And so here's the passage. After a few years, Gilraen took leave of Elrond and returned to her own people in Eriador, and lived alone, and she seldom saw her son again, for he spent many years in far countries. But on a time when Aragorn had returned to the north, he came to her, and she said to him before he went, "This is our last parting, Astel, my son. I am aged by care, even as one of lesser men, and now that it draws near, I cannot face the darkness of our time that gathers upon Middle-earth. I shall leave it soon." Aragorn tried to comfort her, saying, "Yet there may be light beyond the darkness, and if so, I would have you see it and be glad." But she only answered with this linode, "Oini Astel Edayan, Shebin Astel Anim." Now, the literal meaning of this Elvish phrase, I am informed, is, "I give hope to the Dunedain, I have kept no hope for myself." But many commentaries, and indeed Peter Jackson's film, where the phrase becomes an exchange between Elrond and Aragorn, they obviously pluck it out of there, is rendered, "I have given hope to men and kept none for myself." Tolkien, for all his subtlety as a linguist, can be very literal. Mount Doom. Aragorn is called Astel, and Astel means hope. So his mother is clearly saying that her son is the only hope against the gathering darkness. This we see demonstrated repeatedly. It's Aragorn who saves the hobbits from the wraiths at Bree, Aragorn who rallies the defenses of Rohan, Aragorn who can command the men of the mountain to fight, Aragorn who brings healing to those wounded unto death in the houses of healing. But he was not always eager to be this hope. Certainly he was never a reluctant or a cowardly warrior, but Tolkien conveys clearly that what Aragorn does, all of these great achievements, are because he is a king. This is the fate with which Aragorn is uneasy. To be a king is not actually to have a terrible power like Sauron, but to serve, to pour oneself out for others. In a world where kingship holds a spark of divine mystical power, Aragorn's task cannot be left to anyone else. It's not just a matter of finding another able warrior. All the strength and wisdom Aragorn has cultivated is put at the service of others. And so, you see, it's done differently in the films and in the books. But, for example, in the Houses of Healing, and this is my favorite example, you have Faramir lying close to death, you have Éowyn lying close to death, and it's Aragorn who asks for the herb, the Adeles, which, he says in the common tongue it's king's foil. Well, obvious as that. And it has this scene where he takes the herb, crushes it in his hand, breathes on it. And so it's the connection between the kingship and, what he can find in nature, but something that he can do because of who he is. And so there's obviously a reference back to, the medievalism and the divine right of kings, but there's a specific way that magic works in Middle-earth, such that who you are very much matters. And so we have, this is something only the king can do, that he anoints them, that he speaks these words. And you say, you want to talk about sacramentality, here we have, kind of an image of confession, this idea of bringing healing through the hands and the words of the king. And so there's nothing in Aragorn, in the character, the way Tolkien sets it up, that allows him to keep this power for himself. It is all, the kingship of Aragorn is completely sacrificial in the way that it's put together. Now, obviously, as we read this, we start thinking, well, Jesus was a king. This must be sacramental. Well, yes, but the messianic symbolism in Tolkien's stories is really diffuse. There's no one Christ-like figure. Certainly Aragorn appears as king and priest, but there's something of both priest and prophet about Gandalf, who likewise sacrifices himself, more literally than Aragorn does, and actually rises again, which is a pretty strong symbol. And there are many figures in the stories who have a messianic feel to them. Certainly the way that we see, Frodo kind of poured out as the suffering servant at the end. Even Éowyn, I've seen argued, has this kind of, this Christ-like imagery in how she's portrayed. But this is precisely how Tolkien so effectively conveys his ethic of sacrifice, that it's spread through everybody. It's not held to kind of this one figure. And if you identify with Aragorn, you are called to be sacrificial, or Gandalf. It's through everybody. It's the messianic symbolism, as you look at each character and how it applies, has a lot to do with sacrifice. This is what I see happening in Tolkien, is the sacrifice diffused through the story. The divine spark of moral action, the divine spark in moral action is the Christ-like ability to sacrifice ourselves. We might say it's sacramental, specifically Eucharistic. And it's not just kings and wizards who must spend themselves to save the world from darkness. Not to relinquish what is good, to fight what threatens to overtake us. This is the task given to even the most ordinary. To Frodo and Sam, for example, to Merry and Pippin. Hobbits are designed to be the most ordinary of creatures, happy with a quiet life, preoccupied with home comforts. Adventures are not respectable in the Shire. It's said again and again. Bagginses were very well thought of. We never had any adventures. We stayed at home and minded our business. Yet the fate of Middle-earth fell into their hands when Bilbo Baggins discovered the One Ring in Gollum's cave. Consider what Gandalf says to Frodo. Behind that there is something else at work, beyond any design of the ringmaker. I can put it no plainer than by saying that Bilbo was meant to find the ring, and not by its maker, in which case you were meant to have it too. And that may be an encouraging thought. There's a force opposed to the darkness at work in Tolkien's mythology. As we're looking at his influences, we can't properly call it fate, because the classical notion of fate was morally neutral. It didn't set itself up, kind of on one side or another. And it seems to be something, if not precisely good, that is at least hopeful. This is what's at work. Evil is spreading, but there is a way, a small chance, the barest glimmer. All that's required of those who are called is absolutely everything. It's very simple. Frodo hates the task, never seeks it, takes it only out of duty, and it nearly destroys him. He's not rewarded for his virtue in the way that we think of heroes being rewarded, as they ought to be, but nonetheless he brings hope and the fulfillment of that hope. I once said to a friend who questioned the Catholicity of Tolkien, he preferred the alternate account, where Lord of the Rings is a sort of Anglo-Saxon mythic revival, an expression of northernness. Tolkien and Lewis were both very, very into northernness for a while, into Wagner and that mythic thing. And he said, this is what's happening, all this Catholic stuff you talk about. Pfft. And my contention is, if Tolkien was not a Catholic, Frodo would have committed suicide. There is no other logical thing. And that sounds very dramatic, but it's this point of the difference between the Catholic worldview and a non-Catholic worldview, and how it is that you approach hope and despair. So, for example, the French existentialist Camus says there's only one serious question in philosophy, which is why not commit suicide? And that's essentially the point that Frodo gets to through the sacrificial ethic, where you don't see him kind of rewarded richly. You can argue Aragorn's going to have a life of service, but he's also going to have a life of comfort if he wants it. He gets, Arwen in the end. We know that they have children. Éowyn's a bit sad because she wanted Aragorn, but then she meets Faramir, and she's lucky because he's truly the best character in the entire book, and I won't hear any arguments against that. They're off happy in Ithilien. Merry and Pippin scour the Shire, return as heroes. All of this is going well. And then Sam goes back, he gets Rosie Cotton, he has a bunch of little hobbits. And then we look at Frodo, and we say, of everybody, who acted sacrificially, what's left for Frodo? And so we have the final chapter. So my contention is, if Tolkien was not a Catholic, Frodo commits suicide because there's absolutely no point. And what we get is something kind of different. I'm not sure I fully understand what Tolkien thought the Grey Havens were, but this is what happens. So we have the elves have been leaving Middle-earth, and so it's an idea of going off to the hereafter, to, fading into eternal happiness. It always struck me as kind of, Platinian, but I don't know what he was thinking. And Frodo's accorded this great honor that he can go with them. And I apologize, if you're a Silmarillion reader and this is covered there, I can't get through it. I'm really sorry. So you can tell me afterwards if this is explained. But we have this scene of parting, and so they're going to the Grey Havens, and Sam is cut up because he's so devoted to Frodo. But, said Sam, and tears started in his eyes, I thought you were going to enjoy the Shire too, for years and years, after all you've done. So I thought too once, but I've been too deeply hurt, Sam. I tried to save the Shire, and it has been saved, but not for me. It must often be so, Sam. When things are in danger, someone has to give them up, lose them, so that others may keep them. This is the concise articulation of Tolkien's moral ethos, the reality of sacrifice. It's not a symbolic giving up. What Frodo wanted more than anything is truly lost to him. The only kind of motivation he has in keeping this ring, personal motivation. He knows the big picture. He understands, the Dark Lord coming to power would be a very bad thing. But what keeps him going is the desire to save the Shire, knowing that, all that he has loved and valued is at stake here. And that one thing that he's going for is lost to him through sacrifice. So it's a great strength of Tolkien's, I think, sacramental imagination, that he allows sacrifice to have this kind of reality. Because very often we have this kind of phony sacrifice. I'm going to show you that I'm willing, to give this up. But in the end, it's so I can be more richly rewarded than I imagined beforehand. Tolkien allows sacrifice to be a real component of his ethics in the way that we could say, although we wouldn't say that God loses, but in the way that the Eucharist is a real sacrifice. The importance of the reality of sacrifice in the Catholic tradition, is central. We have to understand that what Christ did was real, that he actually suffered on the cross, that he actually died on the cross. That Jesus, who didn't need to give up his life, actually gave it up, not in some sort of pantomime or play acting. And so at the heart of Tolkien's understanding, and if you like, you can argue with me about the Catholicity of this, but I do see it as a big strength, is this idea of the reality of sacrifice that runs through his ethics. And so even more so than lembas bread or elven rope, this is where I see the sacramentality of his imagination. Now, Tolkien once wrote that his trilogy was about death, and he was promptly criticized on the basis that this is a theme that is wholly absent from the books, nearly. A lot of critics, he said, I wrote a trilogy about death, and they said, but almost everyone lives, except Sean Bean. Only Boromir, Theoden, and Denethor really die of the main characters. I couldn't think of anybody else. But I don't think Tolkien was necessarily being literal. Death to self, played out in heroic sacrifice, is a Catholic theme with a long history and deep resonance within the tradition. As a feature of a very Catholic imagination, it says to us that to be good is not just to resist doing evil, it's to fight it and not to count the cost. A similar lesson comes to us each week in the sacrifice of the Mass. So, I'm at time, and I'm also at my concluding paragraph, so this all worked out. To try very briefly to draw together the strands of this presentation. I will admit that I have presented you with two very different authors. Some would say Jane Austen gives a very feminine and domestic view of virtue, whereas Tolkien's stories speak of a more courageous, traditionally masculine morality. This is a topic for a different presentation. But what I hope I've managed to convey is how very Catholic the moral imagination of these two authors is, how they present what virtue is and what is at stake if it's lost, and given some indication of how such writers can influence our own imagination, hopefully for the better.